Chapter 14. Well, is she pretty? Ah, friend, my pink one is delicious, her name is Dunyasha. But on glancing at Rostov's face, Aline stopped short. He saw that his hero and commander was following quite a different train of thought. Rostov glanced angrily at Aline and without replying strode off with rapid steps to the village. I'll show them, I'll give it to them, the brigands, said he to himself. Alpatik at a gliding trot, only just managing not to run, kept up with him with difficulty. What decision have you been pleased to come to, said he. Rostov stopped and, clenching his fists, suddenly and sternly turned on Alpatik. Decision? What decision? Old dotard, cried he. What have you been about? The peasants are rioting, and you can't manage them? You're a traitor yourself. I know you. I'll flay you all alive, and as if afraid of wasting his store of anger, he left Alpatik and went rapidly forward. Alpatik, mastering his offended feelings, kept pace with Rostov at a gliding gait and continued to impart his views. He said the peasants were obdurate and that at the present moment it would be imprudent to over-resist them without an armed force, and would it not be better first to send for the military? I'll give them armed force. I'll over-resist them, uttered Rostov meaninglessly, breathless with irrational animal fury and the need to vent it. Without considering what he would do, he moved unconsciously with quick, resolute steps toward the crowd. And the nearer he drew to it, the more Alpatik felt that this unreasonable action might produce good results. The peasants in the crowd were similarly impressed when they saw Rostov's rapid, firm steps and resolute, frowning face. After the hussars had come to the village and Rostov had gone to see the princess, a certain confusion and dissension had arisen among the crowd. Some of the peasants said that these new arrivals were Russians and might take it amiss that the mistress was being detained. Dron was of this opinion, but as soon as he expressed it, Karp and others attacked their ex-elder. How many years have you been fattening on the commune? Karp shouted at him. It's all one to you. You'll dig up your pot of money and take it away with you. What does it matter to you whether our homes are ruined or not? We've been told to keep order, and that no one is to leave their homes or take away a single grain, and that's all about it, cried another. It was your son's turn to be conscripted, but no fear. You begrudged your lump of a son. A little old man suddenly began attacking Dron, and so they took my Venka to be shaved for a soldier. But we all have to die. To be sure, we all have to die. I'm not against the commune, said Dron. That's it, not against it. You've filled your belly. The two tall peasants had their say. As soon as Rostov, followed by Aline, Lavrushka, and Alpatik, came up to the crowd, Karp, thrusting his fingers into his belt and smiling a little, walked to the front. Dron on the contrary retired to the rear and the crowd drew closer together. Who is your elder here? Hey, shouted Rostov, coming up to the crowd with quick steps. The elder? What do you want with him? Asked Karp. But before the words were well out of his mouth, his cap flew off and a fierce blow jerked his head to one side. Caps off, traitors, shouted Rostov in a wrathful voice. Where's the elder? He cried furiously. The elder. He wants the elder. Dron Zakharik, you, meek and flustered voices here and there were heard calling and caps began to come off their heads. We don't riot, we're following the orders, declared Karp, and at that moment several voices began speaking together. It's as the old men have decided, there's too many of you giving orders. Arguing. Mutiny. Brigands. Traitors, cried Rostov unmeaningly in a voice not his own, gripping Karp by the collar. Bind him, he shouted, though there was no one to bind him but Lavrushka and Alpatik. Lavrushka, however, ran up to Karp and seized him by the arms from behind. Shall I call up our men from beyond the hill? He called out. Alpatik turned to the peasants and ordered two of them by name to come and bind Karp. The men obediently came out of the crowd and began taking off their belts. Where's the elder? Demanded Rostov in a loud voice. With a pale and frowning face Dron stepped out of the crowd. Are you the elder? Bind him, Lavrushka, shouted Rostov, as if that order, too, could not possibly meet with any opposition. And in fact 2 more peasants began binding Dron, who took off his own belt and handed it to them, as if to aid them. "And you all listen to me," said Rostov to the peasants. "Be off to your houses at once, and don't let one of your voices be heard. Why, we've not done any harm. We did it just out of foolishness. It's all nonsense." I said then that it was not in order. Voices were heard bickering with one another. "There. What did I say?" said Alpatych, coming into his own again. "It's wrong, lads. All our stupidity, Yakov Alpatych," came the answers, and the crowd began at once to disperse through the village. The 2 bound men were led off to the master's house. The 2 drunken peasants followed them. When I look at you," said one of them to Karp. "How can one talk to the masters like that?" "What were you thinking of, you fool?" added the other, "a real fool." 2 hours later the carts were standing in the courtyard of the Bogacharovo house. The peasants were briskly carrying out the proprietor's goods and packing them on the carts, and Dron, liberated at Princess Mary's wish from the cupboard where he had been confined, was standing in the yard directing the men. "Don't put it in so carelessly," said one of the peasants, a man with a round smiling face, taking a casket from a housemaid. "You know it has cost money. How can you chuck it in like that or shove it under the cord where it'll get rubbed? I don't like that way of doing things. Let it all be done properly, according to rule. Look here, put it under the bast matting and cover it with hay, that's the way." Books, books," said another peasant, bringing out Prince Andrew's library cupboards. "Don't catch up against it. It's heavy, lads, solid books." "Yes, they worked all day and didn't play," remarked the tall, round-faced peasant gravely, pointing with a significant wink at the dictionaries that were on the top. Unwilling to obtrude himself on the princess, Rostov did not go back to the house but remained in the village awaiting her departure. When her carriage drove out of the house, he mounted and accompanied her 8 miles from Bogacharovo to where the road was occupied by our troops. At the inn at Yankovo he respectfully took leave of her, for the first time permitting himself to kiss her hand. "How can you speak so?" he blushingly replied to Princess Mary's expressions of gratitude for her deliverance, as she termed what had occurred. "Any police officer would have done as much. If we had had only peasants to fight, we should not have let the enemy come so far," said he with a sense of shame and wishing to change the subject. "I am only happy to have had the opportunity of making your acquaintance. Goodbye, Princess. I wish you happiness and consolation and hope to meet you again in happier circumstances. If you don't want to make me blush, please don't thank me." But the princess, if she did not again thank him in words, thanked him with the whole expression of her face, radiant with gratitude and tenderness. She could not believe that there was nothing to thank him for. On the contrary, it seemed to her certain that had he not been there she would have perished at the hands of the mutineers and of the French, and that he had exposed himself to terrible and obvious danger to save her, and even more certain was it that he was a man of lofty and noble soul, able to understand her position and her sorrow. His kind, honest eyes, with the tears rising in them when she herself had begun to cry as she spoke of her loss, did not leave her memory. When she had taken leave of him and remained alone she suddenly felt her eyes filling with tears, and then not for the first time the strange question presented itself to her, did she love him? On the rest of the way to Moscow, though the princess' position was not a cheerful one, Dunyasha, who went with her in the carriage, more than once noticed that her mistress leaned out of the window and smiled at something with an expression of mingled joy and sorrow. "Well, supposing I do love him," thought Princess Mary. Ashamed as she was of acknowledging to herself that she had fallen in love with a man who would perhaps never love her, she comforted herself with the thought that no one would ever know it and that she would not be to blame if, without ever speaking of it to anyone, she continued to the end of her life to love the man with whom she had fallen in love for the first and last time in her life. Sometimes when she recalled his looks, his sympathy, and his words, happiness did not appear impossible to her. It was at those moments that Dunyasha noticed her smiling as she looked out of the carriage window. Was it not fate that brought him to Bogacharovo, and at that very moment, thought Princess Mary. And that caused his sister to refuse my brother. And in all this Princess Mary saw the hand of Providence. The impression the princess made on Rostov was a very agreeable one. To remember her gave him pleasure, and when his comrades, hearing of his adventure at Bogucharovo, rallied him on having gone to look for hay and having picked up one of the wealthiest heiresses in Russia, he grew angry. It made him angry just because the idea of marrying the gentle Princess Mary, who was attractive to him and had an enormous fortune, had against his will more than once entered his head. For himself personally Nicholas could not wish for a better wife. By marrying her he would make the countess his mother happy, would be able to put his father's affairs in order, and would even, he felt it, ensure Princess Mary's happiness. But Sonia? And his plighted word? That was why Rostov grew angry when he was rallied about Princess Bolkonskaya. Chapter 15. On receiving command of the armies, Kutuzov remembered Prince Andrew and sent an order for him to report at headquarters. Prince Andrew arrived at Tsarevo-Zaymsh on the very day and at the very hour that Kutuzov was reviewing the troops for the first time. He stopped in the village at the priest's house in front of which stood the commander-in-chief's carriage, and he sat down on the bench at the gate awaiting His Serene Highness, as everyone now called Kutuzov. From the field beyond the village came now sounds of regimental music and now the roar of many voices shouting, "Hurrah!" to the new commander-in-chief. 2 orderlies, a courier and a majordomo, stood nearby, some 10 paces from Prince Andrew, availing themselves of Kutuzov's absence and of the fine weather. A short, swarthy lieutenant colonel of hussars with thick mustaches and whiskers rode up to the gate and, glancing at Prince Andrew, inquired whether His Serene Highness was putting up there and whether he would soon be back. Prince Andrew replied that he was not on His Serene Highness' staff but was himself a new arrival. The lieutenant colonel turned to a smart orderly, who, with the peculiar contempt with which a commander-in-chief's orderly speaks to officers, replied. "What? His Serene Highness? I expect he'll be here soon. What do you want?" The lieutenant colonel of hussars smiled beneath his mustache at the orderly's tone, dismounted, gave his horse to a dispatch runner, and approached Bolkonsky with a slight bow. Bolkonsky made room for him on the bench and the lieutenant colonel sat down beside him. "You're also waiting for the commander-in-chief," said he. "They say he receives everyone, thank God. It's awful with those sausage-eaters. Ermolov had reason to ask to be promoted to be a German. Now Pwaps Wussians will get a look in. As it was, devil only knows what was happening. We kept wetwetting and wetwetting." "Did you take part in the campaign?" he asked. "I had the pleasure," replied Prince Andrew, "not only of taking part in the retreat but of losing in that retreat all I held dear, not to mention the estate and home of my birth, my father, who died of grief. I belong to the province of Smolensk." "Ah. You're Prince Bolkonsky. Very glad to make your acquaintance." "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Denisov, better known as Vaska," said Denisov, pressing Prince Andrew's hand and looking into his face with a particularly kindly attention. "Yes, I heard," said he sympathetically, and after a short pause added, "Yes, it's Scythian warfare. It's all very well, only not for those who get it in the neck. So you are Prince Andrew Bolkonsky?" He swayed his head. "Very pleased, Prince, to make your acquaintance," he repeated again, smiling sadly, and he again pressed Prince Andrew's hand. Prince Andrew knew Denisov from what Natasha had told him of her first suitor. This memory carried him sadly and sweetly back to those painful feelings of which he had not thought lately, but which still found place in his soul. Of late he had received so many new and very serious impressions, such as the retreat from Smolensk, his visit to Bald Hills, and the recent news of his father's death, and had experienced so many emotions, that for a long time past those memories had not entered his mind, and now that they did not act on him with nearly their former strength. For Denisov, too, the memories awakened by the name of Bolkonsky belonged to a distant, romantic past, when after supper and after Natasha's singing he had proposed to a little girl of 15 without realizing what he was doing. He smiled at the recollection of that time and of his love for Natasha, and passed at once to what now interested him passionately and exclusively. This was a plan of campaign he had devised while serving at the outposts during the retreat. He had proposed that plan to Barclay de Tolly and now wished to propose it to Kutuzov. The plan was based on the fact that the French line of operation was too extended, and it proposed that instead of, or concurrently with, action on the front to bar the advance of the French, we should attack their line of communication. He began explaining his plan to Prince Andrew. They can't hold all that line. It's impossible. I will undertake to break Thwof. Give me 500 men and I will break the line, that's certain. There's only one way, guerrilla warfare. Denisov rose and began gesticulating as he explained his plan to Bolkonsky. In the midst of his explanation shouts were heard from the army, growing more incoherent and more diffused, mingling with music and songs and coming from the field where the review was held. Sounds of hoofs and shouts were nearing the village. He's coming! He's coming! Shouted a Cossack standing at the gate. Bolkonsky and Denisov moved to the gate, at which a knot of soldiers, a guard of honor, was standing, and they saw Kutuzov coming down the street mounted on a rather small sorrel horse. A huge suite of generals rode behind him. Barclay was riding almost beside him, and a crowd of officers ran after and around them shouting, "Hurrah!" His adjutants galloped into the yard before him. Kutuzov was impatiently urging on his horse, which ambled smoothly under his weight, and he raised his hand to his white horse guard's cap with a red band and no peak, nodding his head continually. When he came up to the guard of honor, a fine set of grenadiers mostly wearing decorations, who were giving him the salute, he looked at them silently and attentively for nearly a minute with the steady gaze of a commander and then turned to the crowd of generals and officers surrounding him. Suddenly his face assumed a subtle expression, he shrugged his shoulders with an air of perplexity. And with such fine fellows to retreat and retreat. Well, goodbye, General, he added, and rode into the yard past Prince Andrew and Denisov. Hurrah! 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 Shouted those behind him. Since Prince Andrew had last seen him Kutuzov had grown still more corpulent, flaccid, and fat. But the bleached eyeball, the scar, and the familiar weariness of his expression were still the same. He was wearing the White Horse Guard's cap and a military overcoat with a whip hanging over his shoulder by a thin strap. He sat heavily and swayed limply on his brisk little horse. Phew, 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 he whistled just audibly as he rode into the yard. His face expressed the relief of relaxed strain felt by a man who means to rest after a ceremony. He drew his left foot out of the stirrup and, lurching with his whole body and puckering his face with the effort, raised it with difficulty onto the saddle, leaned on his knee, groaned, and slipped down into the arms of the Cossacks and adjutants who stood ready to assist him. He pulled himself together, looked round, screwing up his eyes, glanced at Prince Andrew, and, evidently not recognizing him, moved with his waddling gait to the porch. Phew, 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 he whistled, and again glanced at Prince Andrew. As often occurs with old men, it was only after some seconds that the impression produced by Prince Andrew's face linked itself up with Kutuzov's remembrance of his personality. "Ah, how do you do, my dear prince? How do you do, my dear boy? Come along," said he, glancing wearily round, and he stepped onto the porch which creaked under his weight. He unbuttoned his coat and sat down on a bench in the porch. "And how's your father?" "I received news of his death, yesterday," replied Prince Andrew abruptly. Kutuzov looked at him with eyes wide open with dismay and then took off his cap and crossed himself. "May the kingdom of heaven be his. God's will be done to us all." He sighed deeply, his whole chest heaving, and was silent for a while. "I loved him and respected him, and sympathize with you with all my heart." He embraced Prince Andrew, pressing him to his fat breast, and for some time did not let him go. When he released him Prince Andrew saw that Kutuzov's flabby lips were trembling and that tears were in his eyes. He sighed and pressed on the bench with both hands to raise himself. "Come. Come with me, we'll have a talk," said he. But at that moment Denisov, no more intimidated by his superiors than by the enemy, came with jingling spurs up the steps of the porch, despite the angry whispers of the adjutants who tried to stop him. Kutuzov, his hands still pressed on the seat, glanced at him glumly. Denisov, having given his name, announced that he had to communicate to His Serene Highness a matter of great importance for their country's welfare. Kutuzov looked wearily at him and, lifting his hands with a gesture of annoyance, folded them across his stomach, repeating the words, "For our country's welfare? Well, what is it? Speak." Denisov blushed like a girl. It was strange to see the color rise in that shaggy, bibulous, time-worn face, and boldly began to expound his plan of cutting the enemy's lines of communication between Smolensk and Vyazma. Denisov came from those parts and knew the country well. His plan seemed decidedly a good one, especially from the strength of conviction with which he spoke. Kutuzov looked down at his own legs, occasionally glancing at the door of the adjoining hut as if expecting something unpleasant to emerge from it. And from that hut, while Denisov was speaking, a general with a portfolio under his arm really did appear. "What?" said Kutuzov, in the midst of Denisov's explanations, "are you ready so soon?" "Ready, Your Serene Highness," replied the general. Kutuzov swayed his head, as much as to say, "How is one man to deal with it all?" and again listened to Denisov. "I give my word of honor as a Russian officer," said Denisov, "that I can break Napoleon's line of communication." "What relation are you to Intendant General Kirill Andreevich Denisov?" asked Kutuzov, interrupting him. "He is my uncle, Your Serene Highness." "Ah, we were friends," said Kutuzov cheerfully. All right, friend, stay here at the staff and tomorrow we'll have a talk." With a nod to Denisov he turned away and put out his hand for the papers Konovnitsyn had brought him. "Would not Your Serene Highness like to come inside?" said the general on duty in a discontented voice. "The plans must be examined and several papers have to be signed." An adjutant came out and announced that everything was in readiness within. But Kutuzov evidently did not wish to enter that room till he was disengaged. He made a grimace. "No, tell them to bring a small table out here, my dear boy. I'll look at them here," said he. "Don't go away," he added, turning to Prince Andrew, who remained in the porch and listened to the general's report. While this was being given, Prince Andrew heard the whisper of a woman's voice and the rustle of a silk dress behind the door. Several times on glancing that way he noticed behind that door a plump, rosy, handsome woman in a pink dress with a lilac silk kerchief on her head, holding a dish and evidently awaiting the entrance of the commander-in-chief. Kutuzov's adjutant whispered to Prince Andrew that this was the wife of the priest whose home it was, and that she intended to offer His Serene Highness bread and salt. "Her husband has welcomed His Serene Highness with the cross at the church, and she intends to welcome him in the house. She's very pretty," added the adjutant with a smile. At those words Kutuzov looked round. He was listening to the general's report, which consisted chiefly of a criticism of the position at Tsarevozamish, as he had listened to Denisov, and 7 years previously had listened to the discussion at the Austerlitz Council of War. He evidently listened only because he had ears which, though there was a piece of tow in one of them, could not help hearing, but it was evident that nothing the general could say would surprise or even interest him, that he knew all that would be said beforehand, and heard it all only because he had to, as one has to listen to the chanting of a service of prayer. All that Denisov had said was clever and to the point. What the general was saying was even more clever and to the point, but it was evident that Kutuzov despised knowledge and cleverness, and knew of something else that would decide the matter, something independent of cleverness and knowledge. Prince Andrew watched the commander-in-chief's face attentively, and the only expression he could see there was one of boredom, curiosity as to the meaning of the feminine whispering behind the door, and a desire to observe propriety. It was evident that Kutuzov despised cleverness and learning and even the patriotic feeling shown by Denisov, but despised them not because of his own intellect, feelings, or knowledge. He did not try to display any of these, but because of something else. He despised them because of his old age and experience of life. The only instruction Kutuzov gave of his own accord during that report referred to looting by the Russian troops. At the end of the report the general put before him for signature a paper relating to the recovery of payment from army commanders for green oats mown down by the soldiers, when landowners lodged petitions for compensation. After hearing the matter, Kutuzov smacked his lips together and shook his head. "Into the stove, into the fire with it. I tell you once for all, my dear fellow," said he, "into the fire with all such things. Let them cut the crops and burn wood to their heart's content. I don't order it or allow it, but I don't exact compensation either. One can't get on without it. When wood is chopped the chips will fly. He looked at the paper again. Oh, this German precision, he muttered, shaking his head.